Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jesse Montero, and I am the director of Yonkers Public Library. Welcome to the Grinton I Library, and if you're coming from out of town, welcome to Yonkers. So we are very excited to have two authors and researchers of this caliber here at our library. We're also very proud that one of them, Mary Calvi, this is her hometown library, although she has been a friend to libraries throughout Westchester with doing many events there, and been a friend to authors and readers everywhere with her Club Calvi Book Club. If you're here for the author talks, we have some exciting upcoming events we want to make you aware of. National Book Award winning author Colin McCann is going to be here at May 6th at School 15. And Simon Winchester will be at the Asbury Crestwood United Methodist Church. Both of these are part of a year-long celebration for the Crestwood Library Centennial, so check those out. We also have a number of America 250 related events. You can look at ypl.org for those, or just pick up some of the flyers on your way out. Just a little bit of housekeeping. This event is going to last about an hour before we exit, and when you exit, you'll be able to buy books from either of the authors and get them signed as well. If you're new to this building, welcome. We have restrooms that are outside the auditorium lobby and just up a few stairs at the parking lot level. And while we are here, we're going to ask you to silence your phones. So although we're pleased to host this event, it is a county-wide celebration sponsored by the Westchester Library System, and we thank them for helping to make this happen. But one of the true motivating forces behind making this event possible was my wonderful colleague, Yvonne Check, director of the John C. Hart Library in Yorktown, and also the chair of the One County, One Read Committee, which selected Stacy's book. So I am so pleased to welcome you here. Thank you, Yvonne.
Thank you, Jesse. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome, and thank you, Jesse, for that intro. It's really so great to see so many of you here today and coming together as we celebrate our One County, One Read. This is a program that asks all people across Westchester County in all the towns and cities to read the same book and to have conversations around that book. So it's a really exciting program, and it's a true celebration of literature, history, and community. And it's really worth pausing for just a moment to recognize that gatherings like this, where you're all coming together around a book, are exactly what libraries are all about. A place where people can get together and reflect and share ideas and talk about what they're reading. That's exactly what libraries are for. So libraries are books, of course, but they're also spaces that sustain informed communities. And they encourage curiosity and create opportunities for conversations like the one we're about to have today. The title that was selected for this first ever One County, One Read is The Revolutionary Samuel Adams. It's a work that feels especially meaningful this year as we work toward commemorating the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And in this deeply researched and beautifully written book, author Stacy Schiff brings a new dimension to the figure of Samuel Adams, revealing him not simply as one of the founding fathers, but as a brilliant political mind, a master organizer, and a primary driving force behind the movement for independence. Stacy Schiff is one of our country's most distinguished writers. The author of 6 acclaimed books, Stacy Schiff received a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Coleman Fellowship, a George Washington Book Prize, a Pulitzer Prize for her book Vera, and an Academy Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, among many other honors. She is known for her extraordinary ability to animate the past with clarity and nuance and powerful narrative. She has been featured in 2 of Ken Burns' recent documentaries, the 2022 documentary on Benjamin Franklin and the most recent one in 2025, The American Revolution. We are equally honored today to welcome Mary Calvi, whose voice and presence are familiar to so many of you here today. Mary Calvi is a 14-time Emmy-winning New York City news anchor for WCBS TV and Inside Edition. Mary is not only a trusted journalist, but also a gifted interviewer and storyteller and author with a deep interest in history. Mary's 2 books are historical novels. Dear George, Dear Mary is about George Washington's early life, and If a Poem Could Live and Breathe is about a young Teddy Roosevelt. Both of these books reflect Mary's deep passion about literature and history. And with Mary's unique ability to connect past and present and to bring warmth and insight, it makes her the perfect guide for this conversation today. And so now, before we bring out our guests, I do have a few people to thank, because the program would not have been possible without the initial One County, One Read committee, a small but very mighty group of library directors who are Jennifer Brown, Laura Eckley, Catherine Feely, and Dana Heisel. I would also like to extend sincere thanks to the Yonkers Public Library and its director, Jesse Montero, and the entire staff, including Carlos, who's doing our IT today, for providing the venue and for helping to make this event possible. And special thanks to my own library, the John C. Hart Memorial Library, and the entire staff, including Christine Julian, who's in our audience today, for all of their help in organizing and promoting this event. In fact, right now at our library in Yorktown, they are live streaming it, and we've got a full audience there. So we're deeply grateful also to the Westchester Library System, whose sponsorship of One County, One Read helps bring communities together across all of Westchester. So finally, a big thank you to you, the audience. Thank you all for being here today and for participating and for being local supporters of your individual libraries. And so now, moment we're all waiting for, please join me in welcoming with a big round of applause, Mary Calvi. And Stacy Schiff.
Good afternoon, everyone. So good to see all of you. And what a thrill to have you here with us, Stacy, and at such an important time. I know so many of you have questions, and we'll certainly be able to get to them after we have a chance to talk for a few moments. There are so many things I wanted to ask you, but I think that here we are just months from celebrating 250 years of independence, the birth of the nation, and no one better than you to help us really understand how we got here and talk about how you opened our eyes to the importance of independent thinking through the eyes of Samuel Adams. Tell me about him, why you decided to focus so much attention on him and spend so much time with
so much time. So much time, 25 years or something. That's a great place to start. I just want to also thank the libraries. We love libraries. Don't we love libraries? I mean, really. Both for, and especially to Yvonne and to Jesse, and also for fixing the two of us up. Mary, thank you so much for doing this, and thank you all for coming out on this beautiful spring day. I realize this is stay at home and read a book in bad weather, so thank you for your generosity. As far as I can reconstruct it, and the biographer is usually very ill-equipped to analyze her own thinking, I came to this book partly in the wake of an election that had, no matter which side of the aisle you may have been on, make me think a little bit more deeply about democracy and about what democracy requires of a citizen. I had written, the previous book was about the Salem witch trials, and one of the most curious parts about the trials is, along with what afflicted these poor girls who set off the craziness, is how did they end? And one of the answers to that question is one lonely hand that very quietly and fearlessly went up to put an end to this delusion. And his name was Thomas Brattle. He was a very independent thinking, very rich 35-year-old Bostonian. And I was sort of looking for a figure like that, someone who had a contrary spirit and a deep moral fiber, and who I thought could make a difference. And I think that was part of the equation too, was someone who actually moved the needle in some appreciable way. And lastly, I had written about Adams very glancingly in a book I'd done many years ago on Ben Franklin. And I had been working with those materials because I was back in Franklin land momentarily. And I realized he sort of was sitting there on the page, and I realized I knew shockingly little about this person. And when I went back to look at what the other founders said about him, I was kind of aghast at my own ignorance, because they clearly say, I mean, Jefferson says he was the most active, the earliest, the most active, and the most persevering of the patriots. John Adams says the history of the American Revolution cannot be written without Samuel Adams. And here we had totally forgotten him. And that's when I started reading him. I thought I was going to be writing about a medieval woman, and instead I would go into the library and walk directly to the papers of Samuel Adams. At a certain point, my agent said, "You moron, you clearly want to write a book about Samuel Adams."
You know, mentioning John Adams, isn't it that he said that his cousin burned whole handfuls of his papers in the fire in 1770? So first I wonder if that is true, and also, did you question yourself knowing that Samuel Adams had burned so many of his papers? Here you are deciding to research and write about it.
You make an excellent point. If I'd read that passage early on, I might have headed back at the pass. John Adams gives us this extraordinary scene, and yes, I always take John Adams at face value because he's so dyspeptic and so ill-tempered and so vain that everything he's saying must be true. and so quotable, I should add, and so candid, honestly. So much like me in the sense of fact, he's an anxious discontent, and I totally relate to that. He gives us this scene in Philadelphia during when he and Samuel Adams are together attending the Continental Congress, and Samuel is feeding sheafs of his papers to the fire. And John says to Samuel, who is his older cousin to whom he looks up, "Don't you think you're overreacting?" And Samuel says, "I don't want anyone to suffer for my negligence." And then he says when there was no fire because it was too warm, Samuel would cut up the papers instead. So yes, that's the kind of, having to write that scene as a biographer is like sticking a dagger in your own heart.
Yeah, exactly. When you said he did it to protect others, is it he was concerned they would be charged with treason if caught?
I think that's something that we forget to inject back into the story, that all of these men, but essentially the earliest advocates of opposition, if not independence, which is to say Samuel Adams and John Hancock, are essentially walking around with kind of a death warrant at their, they're essentially engaged in sedition. And the danger to which Samuel Adams in particular is subject, and to which he pays no attention whatever, is real. So that for years, and he's really active most active for the 10 years leading up to 1776, countless times over those years, the British authorities will attempt to figure out a way to arrest and deport and try him in London for treason. And what's kind of thrilling is the rule of law prevails. They cannot find a statute by which to extract him and send him overseas to be tried. But, and we can talk about this, when Paul Revere does finally ride off, which is actually the beginning of the book, where he really is going is to warn Adams and Hancock that they are imminently to be arrested for that very reason. So yes, it's because real sedition is being practiced, and these men realize that they are walking around as marked men at that moment. And I do think that grievance of Thomas Jefferson's in the Declaration of Independence about deporting Americans to foreign addresses for pretended offenses, that never happened, but it nearly happened in the case of Samuel Adams.
And as you were saying, you had 10 years of Samuel Adams being a revolutionary before the revolutionary. So there was this revolution in thinking when it came to Samuel Adams, and he was convincing the others that this was necessary.
And that's really John Adams's formulation, and I think it's very apt. How do these colonists go from spotlessly loyal, which is what they are in the late 1760s, to liberty or death in 1774? How does that immensely quick change in thought come about? And Adams is there at the beginning. His first, what puts him really in the spotlight initially is the Massachusetts reaction to the Sugar and the Stamp Acts. And he's there when no one else really cares to bang the drum any longer. He's really there after the Boston Massacre when everyone else has been exhausted by all the street theater and all the violence and all the attempts at opposition. He's still publishing regularly, several times a week, with pieces that are meant to drum up public favor for some kind of redress from the crown.
Wasn't it that he was writing papers even during his time at the university that talked about civil disobedience or, again, the questioning of the independence to Great Britain?
Yeah, I had a lot of fun with this because if you look at he goes to Harvard as an undergraduate and then he does a master's degree at Harvard, which was essentially a sort of remote learning program. You kind of wrote a thesis and you were done. And his thesis, which was, as far as we can tell, the first ever thesis to address this topic, was whether a society owed allegiance to the king if the rights of the citizens were not supported by the king. So was there still allegiance to the king due in a case where the rights are trampled? And he answers that question in the negative. No, there was no allegiance to the king in that case. These are years when most Harvard theses are not on political subjects. They're on subjects like, do the ends justify the means? Or crazy subjects like, do vegetables breathe? Or was the Pope the Antichrist? That was a big seller in Massachusetts in the 1740s. But there tend not to be political themes. And he's already thinking, for somewhat personal reasons possibly, along these lines. And yes, that is the theme, obviously, that 25 years later, will become the center of what he's publishing.
How helpful to you was that thesis as you were researching?
You know, we don't have the thesis, but what we have, and this was very helpful, in the mid-1740s, Samuel Adams and some friends figure out a really easy way to lose a fortune, which is to say they start a newspaper. And that newspaper runs a lot of pieces which are of the flavor of what I just described about, are the rights of the citizenry and the power of the crown in perfect equipoise, or is it tilting one way or the other? And in that paper, there is a very long article, which I'm pretty sure is kind of a redraft of Adams's thesis. I mean, it's close enough to what we know of the thesis, and it's very much in Adams's voice, that I think it's pretty safe to say that this was Adams kind of recapitulating the themes that he had worked up earlier.
Oh, fascinating. I wonder if there was a time or a moment that you see in history that really turned the tide of this obedience to Great Britain to something completely different. We hear so much about the Boston Tea Party, but was there something else?
One of the unanswerable questions, I think when you finish writing a biography, maybe when you finish reading one too, you have certain unanswerable questions. And, one of mine for Samuel Adams would be, who helped you with the Boston Tea Party? Because he's clearly the mastermind largely behind it. But another would be, at what point did you move from redress would be what you're requesting from London to revolt? And it's a very big move. For years, clearly the question here is, could we just stop with all of this discussion of legislation and taxation, and can we just move the clock back to the 1760s, and then everything will be fine and we can go back to the way we were? There's really no question of independence. General historians have suggested that in 1768, in the fall of 1768, when troops first march into Boston, because I think we forget that Boston is an occupied town long before the Boston Massacre, that moment is when Samuel Adams determines that independence is necessary. There's nothing in the documentation or in his publications really that supports that. Having lived, however, in an occupied town for those years, and having come to better see the contempt, if not the condescension, of the British troops and authorities, I think begins to shift the tide for him. The word independence was such a toxic word, obviously, in these years that everyone denies. I mean, Jefferson, John Jay, John Adams, Samuel Adams, everyone denies that independence was ever a word anyone spoke aloud before 1775-ish even. So it's a hard distinction, really. At what point did people really cross that line? It's very hard to determine.
You talked about Samuel Adams and the Boston Tea Party, but it was really no party at that time. But tell us a little about the significance of the Boston Tea Party. I mean, how important was it? I mean, to all of us, it was so important, but was it that important to them?
It's such a great way of putting it. So it doesn't become a party until the 19th century, first of all. It's the destruction of the tea, as properly, of course, it was at the time. It's really a perfect example of the Crown failing to understand the colonial mindset. Because if there's one equation on which Samuel Adams and his friends have insisted for these years, it's a kind of correlation between the sale of tea and the preservation of American liberty. Tea is the one item on which a tax remains. The Crown has no understanding of that, but what they do know is they would like to bail out the East India Company, who are failing, and they would like to kind of undersell the smugglers, and they would like to avoid this crazy American boycott idea. And so they have this idea of essentially dropping the price on tea and handing over the tea tax as it existed to 6 agents who would be posted in Boston and in other towns along the seaboard. That obviously rubs the colonists entirely the wrong way. Every attempt is made to both, first of all, convince those 6 tea agents that they should not execute their duties, and when that fails, to figure out how to get the tea sent back to London. When that fails, the only thing that seems available is, let's get rid of the tea the obvious way. It was so unobvious at the time that the royal governor, who is really the sort of anti-hero of this book, who's the one person who could have opened the harbor and allowed the tea to return to London, doesn't for a million years think anyone's going to dare do this. It seems like the wackiest, most completely ill-reasoned solution, and doesn't think this will happen. So he's appalled the next day when it has happened. Adams has managed before this moment, this is December of 1773, to drum up a certain amount of unanimity among the towns of New England and among the other colonies, many of whom he hopes are going to respond to the destruction of the tea with a level of understanding and a level of commiseration. What really engages the rest of the colonies isn't so much the destruction of the tea as it is the penalty that is leveled for the destruction of the tea, which is to say that the Crown overreacts and closes Boston Harbor, which was essentially a way to starve the town. And that penalty seemed so severe and so draconian that then the other colonists, all of them rushed to be essentially in communion with Boston, begin to send Boston wonderful deliveries of flour and clothes and every other olive oil, every other essential that they might need. But everyone then lands on the same page because it seems that the penalty has been so grossly inflated.
And wasn't there like a ring of protection around those who actually committed this grievous act?
Yeah, in the book I compare the people who actually destroyed the tea to the members of the French resistance, because at the time, no one had been there, and a generation later, everyone had been involved in destroying the tea. There's actually an interesting contrast between the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, in that the Boston Massacre, I think there are 85 witnesses deposed, and no 2 of them tell the same story. Whereas with the Boston Tea Party, you have thousands of Bostonians who were on the wharf that night, and no one saw a thing.
No. Didn't see it.
Impossible to determine who was actually at fault. There are some sailors who were ultimately deposed by the authorities in London weeks later. They all point fingers at Samuel Adams and John Hancock, but they also know that Adams and Hancock were very conspicuously not on the wharf that night. They were back at where the meeting had taken place to decide what to do with this unwanted tea. So yes, it was understood that these people were disguised, and they were in disguise, and they were swarthy, and then slowly that begins to melt into they were actually Native Americans. But the Native Americans comes later, and then the further away you get from the event, the more certain everyone is that it was Mohawks. So then this idea that it was Indians who destroyed the tea enters the drinking water. But the initial reaction was clearly these men who were very familiar with shipboard life. They were by no means Native Americans, they were sailors. Reached into their closets and picked the motliest assortment of clothing they could find. And with those caps and cloaks and having rubbed soot all over their faces, they were the ones who uncrated the tea.
It's such a fascinating story, isn't it? You know, I wanted to ask you about Samuel Adams, because when we talk about the founding fathers, we so often think about Madison, Washington, Franklin, and for some reason, Samuel Adams isn't front of mind. Why is that?
Part of it is this is a little bit what I've sort of alluded to here, he's the master of the kind of street theater. And this is, after a revolution, you don't want the revolutionaries sticking around, right? You want to establish a good, solid government. You don't want the fomenters around. Part of it is that he necessarily erases his fingerprints. This is the no fingerprints school of sedition. So he essentially removes himself from the picture. Part of that is because he doesn't want anyone else to be troubled by any of these earlier activities. But part of that also is because he's not vain. He has this lifelong ability to recruit really astonishing talent and then to step into the wings. And he manages for the spotlight always to fall on someone else. That's really where he's most comfortable. He's a very religious man, I should have mentioned, and he felt basically that he was not answering to posterity, he was answering to the Lord above, and that was really what mattered most to him. And then, of course, he destroys his papers. John Adams does say to him, if you were to collect and publish your papers, they would explain the revolution as nothing else could. And Samuel Adams never does it.
How about that? If you
It
were...
made his biographer's life much easier.
I understand he didn't like to be called Sam, right? Is that true?
It's a little bit like Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin was never Ben Franklin in his lifetime. He was always Benjamin Franklin. But when you signed your name in those days, if your name were George, you signed GEO, period. Mm-hmm. And Samuel Adams usually signed either S. Adams or SAM, period. And so I guess partly because of the beer, we have reduced him to Sam Adams. I'm not sure he had a position on this, or on beer, for that matter.
So he did get something out of this. His own beer line.
Interestingly, just as an aside, the founder of the Samuel Adams Brewery had two ideas. He's a great fan of American history, and he considered John Hancock or Samuel Adams. But John Hancock seemed like a less good bar call than I'll have a Sam Adams. That is how history is made.
Tell me, if you were to name the second most powerful man in the Revolution, would it be George Washington? Is that out of the top two? Would it be? Do you think Samuel Adams would be in the top two?
Let me just say that in the 18th century, and this also kind of thrilled me when I began work on the book. In the 18th century, the two prime movers were understood to be Samuel Adams and George Washington, which totally, threw me for a loop because that's so not our understanding. I think it would probably be George Washington. Out of loyalty, I would perhaps insert Ben Franklin into the picture,
yes.
If only because George Washington could never have achieved in the field anything, much less anything that he did, without the work that Franklin had done in Paris, funding the revolution. There would have been there would have been no munitions and there was no credit, there was no money, there were no munitions, there wasn't an engineer in North America, and all of that was thanks to the work that Franklin did largely off stage in those 8.5 years. So I would probably put Franklin in the pantheon. I think we all have our own private pantheons, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted
Franklin's on the best bill in your wallet, though, so he gets that distinction.
I have many questions to ask you about Ben Franklin as well, Benjamin Franklin. But I was curious. I think people find it stunning that Adams and Franklin and Washington somehow were able to get everyday farmers to come out and take out the British Army and Navy. It's quite shocking that they were able to accomplish that.
It was shocking to the British as well. And I think that's something that, it took me a long time to see this as clearly as I think we should all be seeing it. The level of vanity, the level of ignorance on the part of the British authorities, and the level of vanity, like, who are these pesky farmers? What do they think? Surely they can't be serious about opposing us. So deeply misfires, but also so riles the colonists because they realize they are being treated like second-class citizens. They don't like being treated like second-class citizens. Every petition that they have sent to London has been ignored. Most of the Foreign Office essentially can't locate the colonies on a map. The big question is Philadelphia in the East Indies or the West Indies? The ignorance is extreme, and I think that adds to the level of agitation, obviously, which Adams is obviously very willing to, on which Adams turns up the heat regularly.
Yeah, and that's quite surprising, too. It certainly had to be like a real steely disposition that he had, because you're talking about a massive army, a massive navy, and you don't even have a ship, to fight. So what does it take for somebody like a Samuel Adams to believe that they could actually take control?
I would say that's a great question for a George Washington biographer. I think that Adams actually, when he's in Congress, in the Continental Congress, is regularly put in charge of things of which he's incapable. He's very bad. We should have mentioned this. He's a total failure until he's 41 years old. He runs numerous businesses into the ground, and he's put in charge of commerce when he gets to Congress. But one of the things with which he is put in charge is the correspondence with General Washington. And that's a pretty depressing correspondence, because it's Washington saying, could you send money? Could you send blankets? Could you send? And none of these is available. So it's a pretty one-sided and depressing correspondence. But again, that's largely the work of Lafayette and the French, who jump up to support the Americans.
What can we take from Samuel Adams, do you think, that would be applicable to today's environment, today's political landscape?
I think the thing that what thrilled me, and the thing that I think connected him to Thomas Brattle from the Witchcraft book for me, was this idea of selfless public service, which I think is sort of a shocker to some of us in the world in which we currently live. But there's almost an ascetic commitment to community, and a truly noble, spirited sense of public service. And that Adams really represents, as he does, this sense that one person, that one individual can actually affect a huge change. That change in thinking with which John Adams credits him is something that he single-mindedly sets his mind to. He writes under 32 or more pseudonyms to this end, and he never, ever loses sight of it. Throughout this, the two things I think on which every founder agrees are education, which Adams was a huge proponent for women as much as for men, and also on virtue, on the idea of civic virtue, which is so fundamentally at the fingertips of this entire generation, and with which I think we've lost touch.
How was your writing process and your research process when here you have a man who burned his letters, but also there was not much to know about his family, right? How did you get through that?
I should say that this book, I'll answer your question because I love to whine in public. I should say that this book was written in Westchester, and that it's even the words that are not on the page were Westchester words because they were excised from the original draft by the publisher who lived in Westchester and my editor who lived in Westchester. So all around it's a Westchester production. There's always something around which you're writing. I think there's always something that you don't know. In Adams's case, the domestic life really is missing. There are two Mrs. Adamses. We know almost nothing about the first. They have the same name, which is also not helpful. And we know a great deal about the second because Abigail Adams very much admired her. She was very steely, very resourceful, very pious, extremely well educated, able to discuss ideas with her husband and with his friends. At one point when Adams is in Congress and she's in Boston, the family have no money, and she is engaged in some kind of manual labor. We don't know what it was to support the family. She also writes to him a letter for which she has no pen, so she takes her scissors and pries them apart, and she dips the blade of the scissors into ink and says, "I'm really sorry about my lousy handwriting." Of course, her handwriting is impeccable. So, she's very much of the Abigail Adams school of wifedom, but we know relatively little about either of the wives or about his daughter, in whose education he is indeed very invested. And I think I just dropped every single hint or glimmer that I could possibly find into the book because you want to humanize your hero, and he's clearly a very dedicated family man. But that is something about which that's why I wish I were writing a novel. You have it figured out.
Writing historic fiction was very helpful, especially when you're focused on the women. Many people say, well, why didn't you write it as nonfiction? And the difficulty with women's voices is their words are not preserved, other than in the case of Abigail Adams. And I wanted to ask you about the women of the time, because they had it tough, because they were really kind of holding up their families, but also holding up the town, because the men had been dispersed because some of them were in Philadelphia, but others were fighting the war. So they really had to hold it together.
and even before that, I should have said this, that what Adams manages to do in Boston is what we would today consider like textbook civil resistance theory. He has figured out every means of engaging men, women, and children in this effort. And he spends a great deal of time appealing to New England women who are righteously at home spinning wool and making homespun for their families and not importing British luxury goods with which to clothe their families. And some of the propaganda pieces that he's writing shortly after the arrival of those British troops in 1768 are basically odes to the women of New England, whom he clearly is courting in this way by writing these kind of love letters to their passion for the cause, and says basically they're doing a better job than their husbands are doing. So there's a great shout out there. I'd say that the only exception, I agree with you about the women's voices always being silenced. I had one great experience with the opposite, which is that many years ago I wrote a book about Cleopatra. And Cleopatra, because essentially no Roman wanted to lose to a girl, they had to elevate Cleopatra into this kind of monstrous significance. And so she kind of gets singled out of history and put back on the playing field in a way that I think most women get erased. And that was the one advantage I had in writing about someone for whom there was truly no archive whatsoever.
Your research is so incredible. I mean, it's remarkable, the deep dive that you take. Can you give us an idea of what it took to research Samuel Adams? I'm sure it's enormous amount of time, but give us an idea of how you were able to do that.
How many more hours do we have?
Yeah.
So I'll just want to mention one part that to me was just so thrilling. There was one thing you almost never have when writing about a moment in history like this, is the sense of the man on the street. And what is the actual private individual thinking? Not someone whose name is necessarily going to be in headlines, but just like a common, in this case, Bostonian. In Boston in the 1760s was a 45-year-old, I think, hardware store owner with the brilliant name of Harbottle Dorr. And Harbottle Dorr realized around 1764, 1765, that history was being made, that something was in the air, and he began to keep a collection of newspapers. And Boston was the town of newspapers because, of course, Bostonians, being religious people, all could read, and newspapers thrived there. And Harbottle Dorr keeps this tremendous collection of daily newspapers, which he annotates in a kind of crazy way. I mean, there might have been a little bit of OCD involved here. But he, therefore, first of all, identifies a lot of Samuel Adams's pseudonyms, which we would be otherwise oblivious to. But secondly, he makes great marginal comments, like, he'll see a mention of the royal governor, he'll write the tyrant in the margins, or he'll see a mention of Samuel Adams, and he'll say, or not a mention, a pseudonym of Samuel Adams, and he'll write my hero in the margin. But you really can get a sense of how these pieces of Adams's, how this propaganda, how these British edicts were landing from this voluminous archive, which is consultable online, although I read it in physical copy, at the Massachusetts Historical Society. So that was a huge boon. The reverse of that is that I originally thought when I started researching the book that I would read every issue of every Boston paper that Adams had himself read for those 12 or 14 years. And I mentioned this to the historian Joseph Ellis, who said, I'll see you in 20 years. And that's when I realized maybe I won't do that. And so I did read the two most read Boston newspapers of those years, because without them, you don't know what the town smelled like, what it felt like, what it was responding to, what the stresses were, how much a pineapple sold for. I mean, you get a sense of the texture of daily life, which I think is really important, and also is essential to bringing a character alive, bringing the streets alive, because the streets were so essential in those years.
Give us an idea of the amount of, how many years you spent researching and how many years you spent writing this.
This was my COVID book, so it took a little longer because I think there was a year where I was ordering Purell online and trying to get vaccinations for the entire family. This was it usually takes me 5 years, this book took 6, and it's usually about 3.5 years of research, because I stupidly do almost all of my research first, and then about 1.5 years of really trying as hard as I can not to stray from my desk and writing. But inevitably, you've written 2 chapters or 3 chapters or whatever, and you realize you've forgotten to research something, or a new archive appears, or a new set of letters appears, and you scurry back into the archives because, of course, it is much more fun to research than to write. But it usually it usually takes me around 5 years to put it all together.
For me, I found the blank page daunting, even though there was the research to go with. How do you feel about getting a book started? Do you have to pause, or are you just gung-ho, let's get to it?
I love this question. I feel like I don't know how you all feel, I feel like the first line is really critical. And it's not just critical, I say that not just as a reader, I don't know where the book is going until I know the first line. I feel like it's like the stem cells of the book need to be in that first page somewhere. I also feel as if I have about 1.5 minutes to engage a reader's attention, and if I don't get it then, the book goes back in the bookstore table. So I feel like I've got to get off to a flying start. This book, I don't even remember when I had the idea, but fairly early on, I realized that we all have in our minds the Longfellow verse of Paul Revere racing his way to Lexington to warn that the British were coming, and we can all recite some lines of the poem, but that I had no idea where he was going that night, and that I wagered most of us didn't. And of course, when I realized that where he's going is to talk to Samuel Adams, I realized that Paul Revere would need to kind of ride us into the book in some way. And so that first line is a wholesale ripoff of Longfellow, which one reader recently chastised me for, because I had stolen it without attribution. I thought it was pretty obvious that I was stealing. So I feel like this line, it was clear to me that you had to start there because it did 2 things. It was not what we thought. It left the reader a little bit off balance. What do you mean that's where Paul Revere was going? And it established instantly the eminence of Adams, because who knew he was even part of that picture?
Was it stealing or paying homage, I would say?
Thank you. Would you like to answer the cranky person who wrote me?
So what is next for you?
So for the first time, I've gone back to a previous subject. It's not Salem, I'm happy to say. It's Ben Franklin. And so I'm working on a book about, it's largely Franklin's last 5 years when he comes back to America from France and is such a presence at the Constitutional Convention and changes his mind about slavery and essentially aces old age. But it's largely a book, I hope, I haven't written it yet, about, I'm really good at getting the pitch after I've written the book. It's meant to be a book about his sensibility and about what makes Franklin so Franklinian, because he is, to me anyway, he's clearly the most approachable of the founders, but there's so much of Franklin which I think ultimately will play into the DNA of America, and so it's really a sense of where all of this originates.
Being that you have so many of his papers that exist in letters, is this like a 2,000-page book? I mean, how are you going to bring it?
Maybe because my attention also is addled. I think books should be 320 pages or fewer. And that was a struggle with the Adams book. I thought it should be a short book, which I think it is. Maybe you'll disagree. But the publisher and the editor, whom I just mentioned, both wanted it to be longer. So there was a certain tussle over how long a book it really needed to be. I like to think the Franklin book will be a fairly fleet volume 2, but who knows? You never know when you sit down that's the beauty of writing, and also the terrible, horrible, anguishing part about writing. You just don't know what's going to turn up on the page.
And the beauty of your writing is that you make it so readable and so approachable, and you're dealing with language, especially from the 1700s, was very different from what we were accustomed to. There is certainly a technique, I'm sure, in your mind as to how you create a book that is such that we could sit down and understand it immediately. Tell me about that and your process.
That's just a wing and a prayer, Mary. How do you do that? Do you know how to do that? I think that a lot of the time you're dancing around words that have changed their meaning. The word manly is a very popular word in the 18th century. It's meant to mean just courageous or valiant, but I feel like that's a word that we don't even know what to do with today. So a lot of quoting Adams was making sure I didn't quote the words to which we no longer relate, and where possible translate for the modern reader. It's less of an issue, I think, with Ben Franklin, who is hands down the most beautiful stylist of the 18th century, at least on American soil, and who writes with tremendous fluency and who is always deeply quotable. And I don't think he needs a translator. He sort of speaks directly to us. I think Adams lives so much more in an ethereal world of ideas that he requires a little bit more attention around the edges to bring him closer to us.
How soon might we be able to read your Benjamin Franklin book?
Can I publish just one page and say I'm done? It's a few years away.
All right. Well, we're really looking forward to it. I know we're going to have an opportunity now to open this up to questions. And I know everyone has questions for you, so I want to make sure that we give you time as well. So if anyone has a question, please just raise your hand. I see one back there. Hang on just one second. We're going to get a microphone to you so everyone can hear you.
I usually have a teacher's voice. My understanding of the pamphlet wars between Hamilton and Seabury, and in them Hamilton uses that argument, if I understand correctly, that if you are being treated tyrannically, you have the right to protest and rebel. Did Hamilton and Sam Adams ever meet?
Hamilton and Samuel Adams almost certainly meet, but we have no evidence whatsoever that they did. That idea is very much in the drinking water from the 1760s. Adams has a wonderful line where he says something like, "Very few have the fortitude to tell a tyrant that they would like to be free." It's very much his kind of wording. Everyone is pretty much reading each other at this point. When John Dickinson first publishes his influential pamphlet, everyone assumes it's the work of Samuel Adams. There's a lot of sort of overlapping authorship. I think Thomas Paine is maybe the only person who's so good that nobody else would be mistaken for the author of his work. And I should say to that end that Adams, as I said, is writing under 32 pseudonyms in various newspapers, which means he's writing consistently daily in Boston, and that much of those many of those essays are sent back to London to prove that this individual should be arrested. Very often the essays that are sent back as the work of Samuel Adams are not the work of Samuel Adams. There are a number of people who are writing this kind of prose at the time, who are making that argument at the time. It just requires a lot of sinking into the drinking water.
There are a couple of other questions too in the front, Jesse.
Thank you very much. We've been talking about how Samuel, again, biblical people, they spoke of the book of Samuel, not of Sam, so that's part of their frame of reference. How Samuel Adams and his peers helped George III to lose his colonies, and that came, of course, after James II had lost his job and Charles I had lost his head. Did Samuel Adams and his peers basically give much attention to, or focus attention on, or even give attribution to their predecessors of the 1620s and 30s, like Selden and Eliot at Hampton, who basically laid the arguments that were used by the Americans 150 years later? Did they make any reference and pay homage to them?
These are men who are very well steeped in history. There's a lot of Oliver Cromwell talk. There's a great deal of understanding of what has happened with British monarchs. There's also an enormous and perhaps prevailing familiarity with the Bible. And very often the imagery that you see is biblical imagery. I mean, there's an enormous amount of Egyptian overlords and taskmasters. And you see that particularly, Adams at the end of 1772 establishes his committees of correspondence, which essentially wires the continent for revolution. And the language that he begins to disseminate through those committees, all of it arrives very largely on the same page, in the same biblical language, using the same biblical metaphor. So I would say that was the predominant trope, but these men very well know what they're following upon and are very quick to say, yes, there are mobs in Boston, but there are a lot of mobs in London too.
I haven't been able to find in Founders Online much reference to their 1630s ancestors in England.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, Jesse.
I'm Mary.
You're the French enthusiast.
Yeah,
Thank you.
sorry. So I have a question. What was the relationship between Samuel and Washington? Were they did they trust each other? Were they supporting of each other? Was, Washington obviously having decided, was support from the French or whatever it is. How does Samuel felt about what was going on and what's the possibility of the new page was happening?
You mean Samuel Adams, not Ben Franklin?
Yeah.
There's almost no relationship there, except that they are corresponding these years because Adams is the sort of designated person in Congress to write to Washington to answer his letters. And Washington is almost never in the same place. I'm just trying to think if they're ever in the same place. They're in the same place very briefly, but Washington is out in the field. Adams never leaves Congress for those years. And when he does finally go back to Boston, it will be another 8 or 9 years before he sees Washington as a civilian again. Washington will come to Boston on a visit. This is post-revolution, and he's accompanied around town by John and Samuel because John Hancock is having a little bit of a snit fit, and he doesn't think that Washington has paid him enough deference, so he doesn't come out to meet Washington. So you have very tall Washington flanked by the 2 squat Adamses walking around Boston, and John Adams, in a sort of vainglorious moment, says, here are 3 men who on whom a revolution can pivot, or he makes some sort of wonderful claim for the 3 of them. So that's sort of a symbolic moment in which we see the 3 of them, or Samuel next to George Washington. It's by no means a close relationship. They weren't friendly. They were of very different backgrounds. And also, Adams is a generation, I should have said this, a generation older than everyone else. Old enough to be the father of some of Alexander Hamilton or some of the younger revolutionaries, and is therefore almost off the scene by the time that they come into their own. And for example, when John Adams comes into his own, Samuel is really off stage already.
I'm very happy to hear that you might write another Ben Franklin book. I read the first one, and I'm a native of Philadelphia, grew up there, educated there, so we were very educated and inculcated with information about Ben Franklin. So I'm very happy to hear that you might do another one. One of the points that I recently found out about, you mentioned the Tea Party, the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act. Weren't the British in a lot of financial trouble? And they needed all this money to fight their other wars, their wars in Europe, maintain their navy. And I was just wondering what you think their financial position was in that they lost the war.
Let me just start with Philadelphia. The lovely thing, I am doing a book about Ben Franklin. I shouldn't have made it sound as if it was tentative. At least my publisher thinks I'm doing a book about Ben Franklin. And there's a lot of research on my desk. What the lovely thing about researching Ben Franklin in Philadelphia is that every time you look up, there's Franklin, no matter where you are. You think you're safe, and there he is, looking over your shoulder. At the initial, in 1764, 1765, the numbers are shockingly small. The Crown is extracting something like 1,000 to 2,000 pounds a year from the colonies, and it's costing them something like 7,000 to 8,000 pounds to get that money out of the colonies. So they realize, this is Grenville, realizes the equation is not particularly propitious and that something needs to be done. The real point there is the colonies have reached maturity. They are, in the eyes of London, they have flourished. They owe the Crown something for the defense that the Crown has invested in their defense. Therefore, they should be taxed. The bargain isn't so much made because they're trying to fill the treasury. The bargain really is the golden goose is laying these eggs. Why are we not profiting from that? The decision about the tea in 1773 will be different. That's really, it is impossible to think that the East India Company could go belly up. That would be a huge problem. And that was an attempt to both, as I said, ambush the American blockade, undercut the smugglers, to make the Americans accept the authority of Parliament, and to bail out an extremely vital company that was so crucial to the British economy.
You mentioned earlier the line about the colonies being spotlessly loyal, and I remember reading that in the book and wondering if you had maybe included it with a touch of skepticism, or, you know, the lady doth protest too much. Given some of the earlier grievances, you mentioned the land book, which I was so fascinated by because I had never read about that. I think you start off the witches with the colonies getting a new charter sent over from England because they made themselves such a handful under the old one. I was wondering, to what extent you think that the revolution or a separation from England had started decades or a generation before, and to what extent did things really pick up with the impetus of Sam Adams and the other players at that time?
May I just say that you are really the ideal reader, because the land bank is nothing anyone has ever mentioned, ever, in the many times I've talked about this book. This is this really dry moment in Massachusetts economic history that is enormously vital to Adams's thinking, and it ruins his family. I'm sure it changes his thinking, and to which everyone else refers later when they want to talk about disorder in the streets of Boston, because nothing had caused as much prior chaos as the land bank. Thank you for thinking those 3 pages were not as dry as I feared they were. Because it really was like, I knew more about Massachusetts economic history than anyone ever should, and I had to compress it into 3 somewhat palatable pages. I think every time you look at an historical event and then you look at the years preceding it, you see the writing on the wall, which we are going to see ourselves in another generation or 2 or whatever. There's so much of a preview of the American Revolution in what happens in Salem in 1692. They have literally, this is 1692 Boston, they have sent a governor packing back to London, and they're waiting to see what their punishment is going to be. It sounds just like a preview of what's going to happen in the 1770s. And yet we never connect the two. And what was interesting to me when I got to Thomas Hutchinson, the royal governor, and who had written a history of New England, and his reaction to the 1770s was that he keeps looking back to the witchcraft trials and saying it's just like the craziness of Salem all over again. The people are so deluded. But what he meant by deluded were these ideas about independence or about liberty, which strike most of the British administration as crazy. I think they also would have struck most people whom we think of as patriots as crazy too, because that was not the initial idea. The initial idea was really, can we just turn back the clock? Will you please stop with these ridiculous taxation efforts? You have as much right to legislate for us as we have to legislate for you. There's no way we can be represented in Parliament, so we just have to figure out how to make this work. A lot of this trouble is caused by the fact that the Massachusetts Charter never mentions Parliament. So the question of parliamentary authority is really an open book for any Massachusetts citizen. And that was as true in the 17th century, obviously, as it was in the 18th. But I think I would worry about reading forward or backward, I guess, whichever way you want to look at it, to say you could predict that this was going to happen, because it just as likely might not have happened had the Crown been a little bit more amenable to making some kind of effort. I mean, look at Canada, I guess would be the short answer, right? To making some kind of effort to make this all work and not making the whole thing just break.
Hi. So I was wondering about communication. You were saying how Samuel Adams and all the things he was writing would go back to England, and therefore his life would be in danger. But who was taking it back? We're not texting, so obviously these letters are traveling on ship, taking 3 weeks, and then someone's reading it there, and then it has to be 3 weeks back. So a lot's been happening in the colonies during this time period, and so everything is delayed kind of because of communication.
You're absolutely right. There's a time lag. It's a month in one direction, 2 to 3 months in the other direction. This is something that will render the life of Benjamin Franklin, when he's in Paris, impossible, because he's essentially driving in the dark. He's trying to make decisions not knowing if George Washington has won a battle, lost a battle, or disappeared in battle, and he's having to figure out how to negotiate with the French. Adams never goes to London. As a matter of fact, he does not left New England before he leaves for the Continental Congress. That's his first trip outside of New England. But his writings are sent back regularly by the royal governor and the lieutenant governor as proof of his sedition. And again, they are waiting, in this case very anxiously, to see what they're meant to do to discipline these rabble-rousers. And they're waiting for several months between the time Adams's or someone else's seditious piece goes to London and between the time it comes back. So everyone's on a quite long time delay. And that's particularly obvious in a case like the Boston Massacre, where Adams and his colleagues are desperately trying to get an account of what has happened to London before the authorities can get their account of what happened to London, because you could argue that the soldiers fired because they were provoked, or you could argue that soldiers fired on innocent civilians, and you could make either case fairly easily. And it's essential to Adams and company that their account land first, at which they fail. They do a better job after the destruction of the tea, when they have the same issue, if they want to be the first ones to get the story to London, because they know there's an advantage to being the first to arrive on the scene with the narrative.
You know, just because you mentioned text, I wonder in 100 years how historians and authors are going to be able to tell these stories, because you won't have any letters, or probably the papers anyhow. You'll have a series of emojis.
I always tell, aspiring writers that if they're smart, they'll come up with a subject that postdates the invention of the typewriter and predates the invention of email. Yes. Because that's the period where you actually have legible paper archives.
We do one more?
Sure.
One more?
Stacy, as an author and a researcher, how difficult is it for you to maintain objectivity in your research?
Maybe one always deludes oneself into thinking that if you read all the available sources, you are objective. With this book, I had a ready corrective, I think, in that I felt almost equally enamored of Thomas Hutchinson, who was the bane of Samuel Adams' existence, as I did Samuel Adams, who was the bane of Thomas Hutchinson's existence. So I kind of felt I was playing both sides, which I would say was some approximation of objectivity. It's very easy to see what a rascal like Samuel Adams was doing to a decent, sober, diligent public servant like Thomas Hutchinson, who thought he was doing everything by the book and for the best of a society. And it's very easy to make the opposite case as well. I'm not sure that any one of us writes without either some kind of bias or without some kind of acknowledgement, tacit or not, of the time in which we live. I mean, does this book bear some... Here's a better example. Bernard Bailyn wrote about Thomas Hutchinson famously. It's a marvelous biography called The Ordeal of Thomas Hutchinson, which Bernard Bailyn, a Harvard historian who was a mountain of his era, wrote in the midst of the 1768 riots. And so this idea of street protest and of ideas kind of bubbling up from below was very much in the air when he was writing about poor beleaguered Thomas Hutchinson's effort to tamp it down. So, do we always write in the time and with a particular bias that we bring to the page, much that we might try to toss it out? I don't know that there's a test for that. I like to not include something if I only have a glimmer, or if I do include a glimmer of it, to say we only have a glimmer of this. I like to have 2 to 3 sources on something. That obviously isn't always possible. It's particularly not possible if you're writing about Cleopatra, for example.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Stacy Schiff.
Well, I have to say, this is very difficult to wrap up because I could be here for hours listening to both of you. It's so fascinating. Thank you both so much. But I want to say on behalf of all of the libraries in Westchester County, how grateful we are to our guests. Thank you to Stacy Schiff for sharing your incredible work with us, and to Mary Calvi for such a thoughtful and engaging conversation. And so another round of applause for our guests. Thank you. So it's really great to see so many people across Westchester coming together around this book and having conversations, and we hope that you'll keep the conversation going around this book throughout 2026 and beyond. This is a really important year for us all to be thinking about the 250th anniversary, and so I think this book really can be a part of all of our conversations for, as I said, this year and beyond. So for those of you who will be staying behind to meet the authors or get your book signed, here's how this will work. We have the Village Bookstore represented here from Pleasantville. So if you need to purchase a book, you can do so in the lobby, and we'll let you know when it's time to go out and do that. So you can support a local independent bookstore with your purchase, and then you can go to the signing table where we will have Mary and Stacy both able to sign their books there. There'll be a staff member out there to guide you. If you brought your book with you, you can go directly to the line at the signing table. So I want to thank you all, and I hope you all have a safe and wonderful evening.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. You are